On Saturday, November 16th, 1991, a 17-year-old high school senior named Crystal Todd was in her bedroom getting ready to go to a party in the small town she lived in, which was called Conway, South Carolina. Crystal looked at herself in the mirror and put the finishing touches on her makeup. Then she stepped back to get a full view of herself. She was wearing a print shirt, jeans, brown leather shoes, and her favorite brown leather jacket. And in the mirror, her blue eyes shined. Her mom always told her that her eyes were bluer than the sky, and they lit up any room she walked into. After checking herself over a few more times, Crystal felt happy with how she looked, and she was about to head out for the night when the phone in her bedroom started to ring. She answered it, but right away she wished that she hadn't. A young man named Davey, who Crystal had gone out with on a few dates, was the caller. Crystal had told Davey that she did not want to see him anymore, but clearly he had not gotten the message. Davey asked Crystal if she wanted to go out with him that night, but Crystal said she already had plans, so she couldn't. So Davey said, "Okay, well, can we get together another time soon?" Crystal had always been taught to be polite, so she took a deep breath and in a sweet voice told Davey again that she did not think they should see each other anymore, but she hoped they could still be friends. Then Crystal hung up the phone, grabbed her purse, and headed into the living room where her mom was sitting on the couch. She told her mom that she was going out and gave her a hug. Her mom reminded her to be home by 12:30, and Crystal just smiled and nodded. Crystal almost never missed her curfew, and even if she was going to be home just a few minutes late, she always called her mom ahead of time to let her know. So Crystal said goodbye to her mom and stepped outside onto the large wooden porch in front of their traditional country-style house. Then Crystal walked across the yard to her new blue Toyota Celica car parked out front. She climbed into the driver's seat, started the car, and immediately felt a rush of excitement. Crystal loved this car. It had been an early graduation present from her mom. Her mom had even gotten her vanity license plates that read C. Todd. Crystal leaned across the passenger seat, opened up the glove compartment, and grabbed a cassette tape from inside. She put the tape into her stereo, turned the music up loud, and then pulled away from her house and turned onto a tree-lined road that led toward the center of town. Just being behind the wheel of her beautiful new car gave Crystal a sense of freedom that she rarely felt in this small town where almost everyone knew everyone else's business. And as she drove, she looked out at the dense woods that surrounded most of Conway and thought about what her life would be like once she finally left her hometown. Crystal loved her mom and her friends, but she dreamed of driving her new car out of Conway and going to college in another city where she could finally meet some new people and have some new experiences. Crystal finally reached the center of town and drove past the shopping mall and a few fast food restaurants. Then she turned onto a side road, and after following that road for a few miles, she arrived at the house where the party was going to be that night. When Crystal stepped inside the house was already packed with teenagers, and music was blaring from the stereo. One of Crystal's friends immediately came up to her and asked if she was meeting Davey there. Crystal frowned and said no, she was not, and she actually hoped Davey would not show up to this party at all. But Crystal would tell this friend that there actually was another guy Crystal was hoping to see at this party. But when Crystal's friend asked her who this guy was, Crystal just smiled and didn't say anything, like she was keeping a big secret. Then Crystal poured herself a beer into a red plastic cup and stepped away into the crowded living room. Crystal was fairly short. She was only 5 foot 3 inches tall, so once she was in the room, she got up on her toes and craned her neck to see over everybody in the room, but she didn't see the guy she was hoping to see. So she weaved her way through the crowd and found her way to the living room couch. For the next couple of hours, Crystal sat right there drinking a beer, periodically scanning the crowd in hopes of seeing this new guy, but he never appeared. And as Crystal scanned the room that night, she started to become more and more aware of all the happy couples dancing and talking to each other, and it started to make her feel really lonely. And as she started to feel lonely, she suddenly wished that her really good friend, Ken Register, had been there that night. Ken and Crystal had been friends since they were kids, and whenever they were together, Crystal never seemed to get bored. But Ken had graduated a year earlier, and he made it a point now not to hang out at high school parties. Finally, at around 11 p.m., when still this guy had not shown up to the party, Crystal got up from the couch, she made her rounds around the house saying goodbye to her friends, and then she headed back outside. The music from the party faded as she got into her blue car, and then after firing up the engine, she began driving back toward the center of town along the dark road. After a few minutes, Crystal passed the mall's brightly lit parking lot and then glanced at the clock on her dashboard. It was only 11:15, which meant she had a little over an hour before she had to be home for curfew. And Crystal was not about to waste an hour of freedom, so she decided she would at least go out and get some fast food before heading home. After driving a little further down the road, in the direction of the nearest fast food restaurant, Crystal eased off the gas and stopped at a traffic light. She turned up her music even louder and started singing out loud, but then she heard a car horn blaring over the music. She thought she must have missed the green light, but when she looked up, she saw it was still red. She heard the horn again and realized the car that was honking was right next to her. Crystal looked out her passenger side window at this other car, and when she saw who was driving it, she immediately smiled and waved, and the other driver rolled down their window, and Crystal did the same. She rolled down her passenger side window. Then the other driver, while shouting over the music, asked if Crystal wanted to hang out. Crystal's smile instantly grew much wider, and she said yes, definitely. She had about an hour until she had to go home. A moment later, the light turned green, so Crystal drove forward and pulled into the parking lot of a nearby middle school and parked. The other driver followed her. Crystal grabbed her keys and got out of her car, but left her purse behind. Then she made her way over to this other driver's car, she hopped in the passenger seat, and they took off. At 1 a.m. on November 17th, so about 2 hours after Crystal had left that party, her friend, Ken Register, who she had hoped would be at that party with her, was getting ready for bed. Ken had worked his construction job all week and then spent the previous night with his girlfriend at the go-kart track. He was exhausted and he knew he still had to get up early for church. But before he could lie down in bed, his telephone rang. He figured it must be his girlfriend calling to say goodnight, so he reached over and grabbed the phone, but right away he knew it was not his girlfriend and something was terribly wrong. Crystal's mom was the one calling him, and she was frantic. She said Crystal still was not home and had not called her to say she'd be late. And so Crystal's mom asked Ken if he knew where she was or if he had seen her that night. Ken told her that he had not been with Crystal that night, so he didn't know where she was, but he reassured her that, Crystal was probably just out with friends and had lost track of time and would be home soon. But nothing Ken said seemed to calm Crystal's mother down. Instead, she just kept saying, "Ken, I really think something is wrong. She's never late. And if she's going to be, she always calls." And so Ken, who had known Crystal's mom since he was a little kid and could really tell this was a crisis point for her, he told her, "Look, I'll call the 2 closest hospitals and see if maybe she's in one of those." And so Crystal's mom thanked Ken, and he told her he would call her right back after he called the hospitals. After Ken hung up with Crystal's mom, he would call both hospitals, but neither had any records of Crystal ever having come in that night. So Ken called Crystal's mom back and gave her the news, but he told her again that, Crystal was fine. She likely just lost track of time, or maybe she got sucked into dropping someone off who lived far away, but don't worry, she'll be home, everything's fine. Crystal's mom was not buying it, but she did say to Ken that while he was calling the hospitals, she had called the police, and they too told her that this did not seem like a big deal, and that likely Crystal would be home soon. Ken felt terrible for Crystal's mom, but there really wasn't much else he could do, and so eventually they both just said, "Okay, we'll be in touch if we hear from Crystal," and then they hung up, and a little while later, Ken was asleep. At around 9 a.m., 8 hours after Crystal's mom had called Ken, 2 brothers in their 20s were driving down a road in Conway in their pickup truck. The older of the 2 was driving, while the younger brother was scanning the woods outside. He was looking for a good spot to start their deer hunt for the day. And just then, the younger brother said he saw something. So the older brother, who was driving, pulled over to the side of the road and parked, and then after they both got out, the older brother expected the younger brother to head towards the woods to show him what he saw. But instead, the younger brother walked ahead in the middle of the road and stopped over this big stain on the ground. And when the older brother walked up next to him, they both looked down and they could see clearly it was a huge pool of dried blood. In fact, there was so much blood on the concrete that the brothers thought maybe some big wild predator must have attacked a deer in the area, and they both worried that maybe this wild predator was still close by. But then the younger brother pointed to a trail of blood that led from the road to a nearby ditch about 10 feet away. The men looked at each other and then followed the blood trail, and when they got to the other side of the road and looked down into this ditch that was about 5 feet deep, what they saw at the bottom stunned them both into silence. Finally, the older brother snapped out of his daze and started running back towards the truck, and his younger brother followed him. The two of them climbed into the truck, and before long they were peeling out of there, speeding down the road as fast as they could to alert the police. A little after 10 a.m., so about an hour after those brothers made a 911 call, Detective Bill Knowles of the Horry County Police parked his car on the side of the road near the woods and stared out his window at the other police officers who were gathered around the ditch on the opposite side of the road where the brothers had made their ghastly discovery. Knowles stepped out of his car and stretched. It was sunny and very mild that morning. Then, as soon as he was out of his car, one of the officers spotted him and waved him over to the ditch. Knowles walked slowly across the road, staring down at the massive trail of dried blood. Then he reached the officer and looked down into the ditch below. Knowles' breath caught in his chest, and a look of complete shock crossed his face. He had known he was coming to investigate a murder, but the brutality that had been inflicted on the victim he was now staring at was beyond anything he'd seen before. The victim had suffered multiple stab wounds, and whoever killed this person had been filled with a level of rage that Knowles could barely comprehend. Knowles asked the other officers at the scene if they had any details about who the victim was, but they told him that they hadn't located any identification or any vehicle nearby that might help them determine who this person was. So Knowles climbed into the ditch, he crouched down closer to the body, and began inspecting them. He saw there was a gold high school ring on the victim's right hand, so he asked one of the officers to take the ring off. The officer slipped on a pair of gloves and gently removed the ring. Then he held the ring up so he and Knowles could get a better look, and in the sunlight they could read the engraving on the inside of the ring clearly. It said, Crystal Todd. Knowles had children of his own, and so seeing this young woman whose life had been stolen from her really hit him hard. And so right there in the ditch, he leaned over Crystal's body and he quietly promised her he would find whoever had done this and he would bring them to justice. Then Knowles climbed out of the ditch and walked back towards his car. Officers would stay back at the scene to collect blood samples from the victim and from the road, and those samples would be passed on to forensics labs in the area to be tested. But Knowles knew those tests took time, and he wanted to start working right away. So he got into his car and he drove off, determined to keep the promise he had just made to that poor girl. Not long after leaving the crime scene, Knowles pulled up in front of Crystal's house, and he saw Crystal's mom pacing back and forth and smoking on the large wooden porch. He could tell she had not slept all night. Knowles dreaded this part of the job more than anything, but he wanted to make sure Crystal's mom learned about her daughter from him before everybody else in town heard the news. So Knowles took a deep breath, he stepped out of his car, and he approached her. He was tall and in his 30s, with a kind face and a warm demeanor, and when Crystal's mom saw him, she smiled, thinking he might have good news for her. But when Knowles reached her, he put his hands on her shoulders, and a grave look came across his face. And Crystal's mom knew her daughter was gone, and she started crying. In a gentle voice, Knowles told her that they had found Crystal's body, and he said how sorry he was for her loss. Then he made the same promise to her that he'd made to her daughter. He would find the person who had done this. Knowles said he hated to put her through anything else that morning, but he asked her if she could tell him anything about the night before that might help him figure out what had happened to her daughter. Crystal's mom could barely think. She was crying and her hands were trembling, and so she took a long drag on her cigarette and just tried to clear her mind for a second. Then she told Knowles that Crystal had gone to a party the night before and she hadn't come home for curfew. She said she had called around and nobody had seen or heard from Crystal, and one of her friends, Ken, had even called a couple of hospitals to see if maybe she was there, but she wasn't. And then after that, Crystal's mom just said she couldn't remember anything and she went back to smoking. Knowles told Crystal's mother again how sorry he was, and then he turned and walked back to his car. Crystal's mom watched him drive away from the house, and then she went back inside and collapsed on the couch, sobbing. Then she reached over and grabbed the phone and called Ken. On the other line, when Ken heard the news, he was totally devastated. With his voice cracking, he said he would come by as soon as possible. He would be with her so that Crystal's mom would not be alone. Not long after Knowles left Crystal's house, he got word that Crystal's car had been located. It was found in the middle school parking lot. So Knowles headed in that direction. When he arrived, he met several other officers in that parking lot, and he hoped Crystal's car could offer some clues as to what happened. The thing that struck Knowles immediately about the car was that there was no sign of a break-in or a struggle, and Crystal's purse was still in the passenger seat. To Knowles, that indicated that Crystal had parked there under her own free will, and that her murder had likely not been the result of a robbery. Knowles hoped that Crystal's friends might be able to shed some light on how Crystal had gotten from her car in the middle school parking lot to the road where her body had been found. And he knew on Sunday evenings, almost all of the teenagers in town got together to hang out in the mall parking lot. So later that day, as the sun started to set over the woods, Knowles headed to the mall. By the time he got there, news of Crystal's murder had spread all through town, and the local teenagers had gathered together at the mall, just like Knowles figured they would. But instead of making plans or talking about school, the teenagers were discussing what had happened to their friend Crystal. Knowles parked his car, stepped outside, and walked towards a group of kids who were leaning against a car nearby. He introduced himself and asked if any of them had known Crystal. He was not surprised that basically all of them said they either knew her well or had at least spent some time with her in school. Then Knowles asked if any of them had been to the party where Crystal was the night before, or if they had heard anything about what had happened the night before. One of the young women nearby chimed in and said that she heard that Crystal had been murdered as part of a satanic ritual. Knowles sighed and shook his head. The last thing he needed was some crazy rumor about Satanists spreading through town. But then another girl said she was at the party the night before and that Crystal had hoped to meet a guy there. Knowles asked who this guy was, but none of the kids seemed to know. Then the girl said there was another guy who might have gone looking for Crystal the night before. She said his name was Davy and that Crystal had broken up with him after a few dates and he was really angry about it. And all of the other kids in the group agreed. Davy was someone Knowles should talk to. So Knowles got all of the information he could about Davy from this group of teenagers. Then he told them all to be careful, and he headed back to his car. The kids had told Knowles that Davy lived in a nearby town, and back at the station, Knowles got an address. And Knowles had connections in the police force in the neighboring town, so he contacted them and told them what was happening. They said they would round up Davy for him and that Knowles could question him at their police station. And so later that night, Knowles drove out of Conway towards this nearby town, and he was already starting to form a picture of what he thought could have happened based on the crime scene and how he had found Crystal's car. Knowles believed Crystal had parked her car at the middle school by choice and then gotten into another car with someone she knew, and he thought there was a strong possibility that whoever was driving that other car was the person who had killed her. And considering the violence that had been inflicted on Crystal, Knowles thought he was most likely looking for a young man who was angry with her. And Davy, a teenage boy who Crystal had rejected, definitely fit that description. A little while later, and Knowles had finally arrived at the neighboring town's police station. When he got there, an officer from the local force greeted him and told him that Davy was ready for questioning. The officer also said when they picked Davy up, they discovered the exterior and interior of his truck had just been washed, and that the boy had been carrying a pocket knife. Then the officer led Knowles through the station into a small interrogation room where Davy was seated behind a wooden table. The room was very bright and very cold. Knowles took a seat and stared across the table at Davy. Davy was 18 years old, tall and wiry, and he couldn't stop shifting around in his chair. Knowles' expression was blank, and he didn't give away anything he was thinking. Then, in a calm voice, he asked if Davy had killed Crystal. Davy shifted more in his chair and tapped his foot on the ground. He didn't look up at Knowles, but he said he had nothing to do with any crime. He said he'd called Crystal the day before to see if she wanted to go out with him, but she had said she already had plans. Not totally buying his answer, Knowles pushed a little more and asked if Davy made a habit of washing his truck on Sunday evenings. Then, for the first time, Davy looked Knowles in the eye. He smiled at the detective and said keeping his vehicle clean was very important to him. Knowles smiled back at him, at which point Davy looked back down at the floor. Then Davy cleared his throat and said again that he had not seen Crystal the night before and he hadn't even been in Conway. Knowles leaned forward across the table and asked if anybody could back up his story, and Davy said some friends had been with him, so yes. Davy fit Knowles' idea of the potential killer, but Knowles knew he still had to gather more information before he could determine Davy's guilt or innocence. The kid had been a little smug about cleaning his truck, but a lot of young men in the area went out of their way to keep their trucks looking really good. And Knowles knew a knife was most likely the murder weapon, but Davy carrying a pocket knife on him was not out of the ordinary because it was a pretty common practice amongst hunters and hikers in the area. So Knowles told Davy not to leave town and that police would be in touch if they needed more information. Then he walked out of the interrogation room, thanked the officers at the station for helping him, and headed back outside to his car. It had only been about 12 hours since Crystal's body had been discovered, but Knowles already felt like he was running out of time. He knew that the murder of a popular high school student could send panic through a small town like Conway, so he wanted to close the case as fast as possible and reassure everyone that their families were safe. But over the next several days, Knowles questioned all of Davy's friends, and they all corroborated his story that he had not seen Crystal or been in Conway on the night of her murder. And so Knowles started to feel like his chance to close this case quickly was slipping away. A week went by with no new leads in the investigation, and now Knowles found himself standing outside in a huge crowd of people gathered in the church cemetery who were desperate for answers. Over 1,000 people were there to attend Crystal's funeral, including almost every teenager who went to school with her. Knowles could hear crying throughout the crowd as the minister said his final prayer. Knowles and members of his team had come to the funeral to see if anything or anyone might stand out and offer them any sort of clue. But as Knowles watched Crystal's friends and family walk by her coffin to say their final goodbye, all he saw was a town in mourning. Crystal's death had affected everyone, and he knew her murder would stay with this community for decades to come. By the time Knowles left, he knew the funeral hadn't given him any new information to go on. In fact, it had just made it clear how difficult his job would be. In a town like Conway, where everybody seemed to know Crystal, the list of potential suspects was almost endless. So, not long after the funeral, Knowles reached out to state law enforcement and forensics experts in South Carolina for help. And together, they came up with a plan to narrow down Knowles' search. They decided they would use DNA testing. DNA testing is an investigative technique that uses biological evidence found at the crime scene or on a victim to connect a suspect to the crime or to rule out a potential suspect. At the time of Crystal's death, DNA testing was still a relatively new technique, and it hadn't been used yet to solve a murder case in the state of South Carolina. But Knowles wanted to use all of the tools available to him. So the police in Conway made a public announcement that they needed male volunteers to submit samples for DNA testing. Police said these samples would help them eliminate suspects and enable them to narrow down their search for Crystal's killer. Knowles hoped at least a few of Crystal's male classmates who'd been at the party with her would volunteer, but he was astonished when over 50 men in the community quickly agreed to provide DNA samples in the hope it would help the investigation. The DNA testing would be handled by the state, and Knowles was informed it could take months before they had all of the results. He was happy his team had taken another step in the investigation, but he wasn't about to just wait around for test results that might not even lead to the killer. So while he waited for the results, Knowles kept digging into Crystal's personal life. And in January of 1992, so about a month and a half after Crystal's funeral, Knowles discovered something that he thought was a major break in the case. On a cool January night, Knowles sat at his desk in the station reading through Crystal's school notebooks that had been retrieved from her locker. Knowles was exhausted because he and his team had been working around the clock on this case for months, but he refused to let that exhaustion get in the way of the promise he had made to Crystal and her mother. Knowles rubbed his eyes, picked up the mug on his desk, took a sip of coffee, and kept reading over the notebooks. He was looking for anything that might help his investigation, but as he read, he just started to feel a deep sense of sadness. Amidst Crystal's notes for her high school classes, he saw drawings she had doodled in the margins and little messages she'd written to herself. Flipping through the notebooks, all Knowles could think about was how young Crystal was and how full of hope she must have been. But then someone had robbed her of all of that, and that person was still walking free. Just then, something in one of the notebooks jumped out at Knowles. The name Andy Tyndall was written in the flowery handwriting of a teenager who might have a crush. So Knowles flipped through a few more pages, and he saw Andy's name again written in the same way. In the interviews that Knowles had conducted with Crystal's friends, Andy's name had never come up. But now Knowles wondered if Andy was the high school boy Crystal had hoped to see at the party. So during the following week, Knowles dug into Andy's background, but he discovered Andy wasn't a high school boy at all. He was a 31-year-old man who liked hanging out with high school girls. And Knowles also learned that Andy had come to Conway, South Carolina after committing a robbery in Alabama and violating his parole. And so for the first time in weeks, Knowles felt like he might have a real prime suspect. Knowles contacted some of Crystal's friends he'd already spoken to, and he asked them if they knew anything about Andy. And finally, he found one of Crystal's friends who was willing to talk. Knowles met with this girl at her house, and she told him that Andy was like a secret between some of the girls at school. She said he was handsome, charming, and he had muscles like a bodybuilder. She said she didn't know if Crystal and Andy had ever gone out, but Crystal had definitely met him, and she wouldn't have been surprised if Crystal did have a crush on him. That was the connection between Crystal and Andy that Knowles was looking for. And the fact that Andy had violated parole in another state was enough for police to bring him in. And so on January 21st, 1992, over 2 months after Crystal's murder, Knowles sat across from Andy in a small police interrogation room. But unlike Davy, the nervous teenage boy Knowles had questioned earlier in the investigation, Andy was totally calm and collected. Knowles stared at Andy across the table and asked him if he had killed Crystal. Andy didn't flinch. He just said he'd only met the girl one time, months before the murder, and had never seen her again. Knowles, who almost always kept his cool, started to get frustrated. He took a deep breath and he asked Andy why a 31-year-old man was hanging out with high school girls. But Andy said he had just talked to some of the high school girls when they'd ended up at the same events in town. Nothing more than that. Then Knowles took another breath and just stared at Andy, trying to get a read on him. Knowles wasn't sure if Andy was guilty, but his name was in Crystal's notebook and he was a known criminal, and Knowles didn't want to just let him walk. So Knowles leaned forward in his chair and asked if Andy would be willing to submit samples for DNA testing. Andy stared back at Knowles for a bit, and then, in the same calm voice he'd had throughout the entire interview, he said he would do it. Andy's DNA samples would be added to the other DNA samples that state authorities were already testing from the volunteers around town. And in early February of 1992, almost 3 months after Crystal's murder, Knowles would finally see the results from those DNA tests. And Knowles' theory that the killer was a man who felt Crystal had wronged him in some way would be proven true. And Knowles would rediscover a detail from his investigation that would solidify the killer's motive. Based on DNA test results, evidence collected at the murder scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Crystal Todd in the early morning hours of November 17, 1991. At about 11:15 p.m. on November 16th, Crystal's killer cruised down the tree-lined road that cut right through Conway in his blue Plymouth Sundance car. He passed by the mall and glanced out the window to see if anyone was hanging out, but the parking lot was empty, so he kept on driving. It was getting late, but he really wanted to find a girl to spend some time with. Then he looked up the road ahead of him and saw a car coming to a stop at a red light. He looked closer and saw the vanity license plates that said C. Todd, and he started laughing. He knew that was Crystal's car, and if he could have picked one girl in town to be with right now, it would have been her. So the killer pulled up right next to Crystal's car and began honking. She didn't respond, so he leaned on his horn even harder, and this time it worked, and Crystal looked over at him and she smiled, he smiled back, and he felt his heart beat a little bit faster. Then he rolled down his window and she did the same, and then he asked her if she wanted to hang out and she said yes, and then the light turned green and he followed her into the middle school parking lot. The killer watched as Crystal walked past his car and climbed into his passenger seat. Once she was in the car, he started driving, and they began talking about the party she had just gone to. As Crystal spoke, the killer began looking out the window, searching for the perfect spot away from all the lights in the center of town. And when those lights were far behind him in the rearview mirror, and the road was so dark they could barely see the woods on either side, he pulled off the road and parked. Crystal asked him what he was doing, and he told her that it would be easier for them to talk if they weren't driving. His heart started beating faster, and he was breathing heavily. He looked at Crystal and smiled. Then he took off his seatbelt, he leaned over the passenger seat and tried to kiss her. Crystal told him this is not what she wanted, but he didn't listen. Crystal tried to push him off of her and get out of the car, but she couldn't. She was trapped. Then the killer forced himself on Crystal and sexually assaulted her. Sometime after midnight, when Crystal had finally gotten free, she grabbed her shirt and jeans from the floorboard, she got out of the car, began getting dressed, and then she began screaming at the killer through the open passenger door. Inside the car, the killer seethed, and his head started pounding, and he just wanted her to stop screaming, but she wouldn't stop. So the killer opened the glove compartment and grabbed a knife with a locking blade that he kept in his car. Then he opened his door and he rushed around the car towards Crystal, who was still getting dressed. Before Crystal could react, he grabbed her shoulder and slammed the knife into her skull. Crystal felt the right half of her body go completely numb. Then the killer pulled the knife out and Crystal staggered forward in the road. The killer followed with his knife raised, and Crystal held up her left hand to try to stop him, but there was nothing she could do. He stabbed her in the chest and she fell down, but the killer kept going. The killer would stab Crystal 31 times, and some of the wounds were inflicted after she was clearly already dead. Finally, the killer stopped, looked at what he'd done, and started to panic. The road was dark, but in the moonlight, he could see where the road dropped into a ditch on the opposite side from where he had parked. So he grabbed Crystal under the arms, dragged her body across the road, and threw her in the ditch. Then he ran back to his car, slammed the door, and sped off down the road. And he didn't stop until he parked in front of his house. Before he got out, he looked over the car to see if there was anything Crystal had left behind, and he saw her keys on the floorboard of the passenger seat. He grabbed her keys, got out of the car, and ran across the porch to the front door. His hand was shaking, and his house key rattled the doorknob as he unlocked the door. Once he was inside, he ran to his room, and he hid Crystal's keys in a drawer. And when he looked down at his hands, he finally realized he was covered in blood. So he stripped down, ran to the bathroom, and took a shower. Afterwards, his hands were still trembling, but he was breathing a little easier. So he walked back to his bedroom and got dressed for bed. But before he could lie down, the phone rang. He figured it was his girlfriend calling to say goodnight, so he grabbed the phone. But when he answered, it was not his girlfriend, it was Crystal's mother, who was frantic because her daughter had not come home. Ken Register, who was one of Crystal's best friends since childhood, who was a pallbearer at Crystal's funeral, and who was the person who had comforted Crystal's mother after she found out her daughter had been killed, had been the one who murdered Crystal. It would turn out that Ken fit the description of the killer Knowles had first imagined, a young man who knew Crystal and who believed he had some reason to be angry with her. But the detail from early interviews that Knowles had rediscovered, the one that would clarify Ken's motive, was that Crystal and Ken had briefly dated years before the murder, and Crystal had broken up with him because she thought they were better off as friends. But Ken didn't see it that way, and he believed Crystal belonged to him. And his desire to have her for himself, no matter the cost, had grown over the years. And then, on the night of the murder, Ken was driving home from the go-kart track when he saw Crystal at the red light, and he decided that was the night they were going to be together. And when Crystal tried to push him off of her in the car, he flew into a violent rage. It would turn out Crystal's murder was the first murder case in South Carolina solved by using DNA evidence, because Ken had been one of the people in town who had quickly provided a DNA sample when police asked for volunteers, and Ken's DNA sample had linked him to the sexual assault and the murder. Ken would later suggest he had provided those samples despite being guilty because he didn't fully understand how DNA evidence could tie him to the crime. Ken would ultimately confess to the murder, he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Then, in 2022, over 30 years after the murder, Ken came up for parole. But Crystal's friends, who still missed her dearly, started a petition to have Ken's parole denied. And Ken eventually just waived his right to a parole hearing, and as of May 2023, he remains in prison. In late 2002, 25-year-old Jason Chase worked as a sheep shearer in an area called Gisborne, which is located in the northeastern section of New Zealand. When Jason wasn't working, he was often on his bike, cycling up and down the coast, preparing for his next road race. In early December of that year, Jason contacted his family, who lived in a small town called Dannevirke, which is located about 200 miles southwest of Gisborne, and he told them that he wanted to come visit them for Christmas. However, he didn't know exactly when he would actually arrive at their house because his training and work schedule were fairly hectic, but he told them, "Don't worry, I will be there at least on Christmas Day, December 25th, or a couple of days earlier." His family was thrilled, and they said, "No problem, we can't wait to see you whenever that is." And so by the time mid-December rolled around and Jason still had not arrived at his family's home in Dannevirke, his family wasn't concerned at all. However, that would soon change. On December 13th, a hunter was driving along the many winding back roads of the Ruahine mountain range. This mountain range, which is located about 8 miles north of Dannevirke, is a very isolated and rugged wilderness area that's full of steep gorges and gullies and very thick brush. And so as this hunter rounds the turn on this road, he looks up ahead and he sees there's a car parked on the side of the road. And so this hunter pulls up right alongside this car and he looks over and he can tell, there's no one inside of it. There's no obvious damage to the car. And then the hunter began kind of scanning around the area to see if there was some obvious reason someone would stop right at that particular spot. But when he looked around, all he saw was thick trees on either side and the mountain kind of sloped down on either side. And so there was nothing unique about the spot. And so something just kind of struck the hunter as odd about this car. It just seemed totally out of place. And so operating on a hunch, the hunter would leave the mountain range and head into Dannevirke, and he would contact police and he would tell them about this car and where it was located, because in the hunter's mind, maybe someone had been reported missing in the area and maybe this car is connected. And so after hearing about the car, the police did not know of any missing person cases that were connected to a car that matched the description the hunter had given. But just to be safe, the police hopped in their vehicles and they drove up into the Ruahine mountain range and they went to the spot the hunter described. And sure enough, off to the side of the road is this parked car and it's still unoccupied. After inspecting the vehicle, the police came to the same conclusion the hunter did, that there was no obvious signs of damage to the car that might have forced someone to abandon it. And then when they looked in the window at the gas gauge, they saw the gauge was full. And so the police kind of wandered around the area, kind of doing an initial search to see if maybe the owner of this car was nearby. But, there was no one there. They're in this very isolated part of this wilderness area. And so the police just took down the license plate of the car and they went back to their station. And when they got there, they ran the license plate number and it turned out the car belonged to Jason Chase. When Jason's family was contacted about, why is Jason's car up in the Ruahine Mountains, where's Jason? His family was pretty surprised. They explained to police that Jason had made plans to come visit them around Christmas time, and so they were expecting him to come this way. And the Ruahine mountain range, it is only 8 miles away from Dannevirke, so in theory, maybe he stopped there on the way to their house, but they told police that just didn't make any sense. So, as a precaution, the police decided to launch a search for Jason. And unfortunately, despite hundreds of people on the ground searching the Ruahine mountain range and helicopters overhead flying all over the place, no trace of Jason was found. And so the official search was called off right before Christmas, but Jason's family and friends, they continued to look for him. And on January 3rd, they would find him. One of the family friends who had agreed to continue looking for Jason after the official search had shut down was a farmer who owned a plane. And on January 3rd, as he did one of his passes over the foothills of the Ruahine mountain range, he looked down and he saw this bright red thing that looked totally out of place. And the pilot couldn't tell what it was, and so he took note of its location, and then when he landed, he passed those coordinates off to the ground team. And so the ground team, they made their way over to this location, which was quite far away from where Jason's car had been. And after making their way through some very thick brush and some very steep sections, they eventually walked out to this big open clearing. It was a dry riverbed. and right in front of them, in the middle of it, was the bright red thing. It was Jason's shirt, and Jason was still wearing it. He was found lying on his left side with his legs stretched out. He had on his bright red rugby t-shirt, some khaki shorts on, and he had no shoes or socks on. According to the searchers who first saw Jason in this dry creek bed, they would say the scene was very peaceful and it almost looked like Jason had lied down to fall asleep. But Jason was not sleeping, he was dead. Jason had no visible injuries and there was no sign of a struggle in the area. In fact, it didn't even look like Jason had been in the wild for very long because his clothes were pristine and despite being barefoot, his feet were in great condition. Despite a lengthy search around the area where his body was discovered, his shoes and socks would not be recovered. The only thing they found in the area was a water bottle that belonged to Jason. Adding to the mystery of what happened to Jason were the results of his autopsy. The pathologist was unable to find any injuries. Jason also seemed well-nourished because he had food in his stomach, and he was hydrated because there was urine in his bladder. His toxicology report also came back negative for all drugs, medications, and a range of common poisons. The only odd thing the pathologist found during the autopsy was that Jason had 2 very small ulcers in his duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. According to this pathologist, these type of ulcers only appear from acute stress moments before death. However, these ulcers don't indicate what caused the stress. Typically, things like severe injury or septicemia, which is blood poisoning, will cause these stress ulcers. But Jason had neither of those. So at the end of the autopsy, the pathologist concluded that Jason had not been the victim of a homicide, he had not committed suicide, he had died from, quote, obscure natural causes. Interestingly, though, the pathologist was able to determine with some certainty that Jason died on or around December 30th, which means he was alive for the entirety of the official search for him, as well as the bulk of that private search conducted by friends and family. After the autopsy results came out, Jason's case was closed, and his family, despite having lots of unanswered questions, was forced to just move on. 15 years later, the same pathologist that had conducted Jason's autopsy was talking to a colleague about Jason's case. And as he was describing where Jason was found, the colleague suddenly stopped the pathologist and said, "Wait a minute, I think I know what happened to him." And it would turn out he did. The following is a reconstruction of what happened to Jason Chase. On December 13th, 2002, Jason left his home in Gisborne and began heading south towards Dannevirke, where his family lived. But before he got to his family's home, he took a detour up into the Ruahine mountain range, where he eventually parked his car on the side of the road. Once his car was stopped, he got out and collected his backpack and sleeping bag. Those were 2 items that were never discovered during the search or after his body was found, but it was later determined they were missing from his vehicle. And so after he has his pack and his sleeping bag, he also grabs a water bottle, and then he leaves the main road and begins walking into the woods, making his way down the mountain. He eventually would find a spot on the side of the mountain that he liked, and so he set up a campsite. What happens next is very confusing because we don't actually know why Jason actually went camping in the first place or when he intended to leave, but we can make one assumption. Whatever he was doing in the mountains, he planned on wrapping it up in time to still get to his family's house in Dannevirke on or before Christmas Day, December 25th. So from December 13th, when he first got out of his car and entered the wilderness, until December 25th, it's believed Jason was, by choice, out in the wilderness of the Ruahine mountain range. And so as this huge search is launched for him in the area he is in, it's entirely possible that he either did not see any of the searchers. This is a very rugged and heavily forested area, and so that's not totally outlandish. Or 2, even if he did see the searchers, he may not have recognized that they were looking for him because remember, during that time frame, he didn't think he was in danger. He was out in the wilderness camping by choice. But sometime around December 25th, or maybe a couple of days before, when he needed to leave and go back to Dannevirke to see his family, after packing up his stuff, for whatever reason, he could not get back up to the road where his car was. Either there was some sort of physical boundary, or maybe he got lost, but either way, instead of going back up the mountain, we know Jason actually turned and began going down the mountain, away from the road and away from his car. It's believed Jason actually just decided he would hike his way out of the mountains. He was in great shape, very healthy guy, and he probably figured he could just hike the 8 miles to Dannevirke, and then he could have someone drive him back up and retrieve his car at a later date. But on or around December 30th, Jason was still out in the mountains. And at this point, he had abandoned his backpack and his sleeping bag and had most likely removed his shoes and socks for reasons we don't know. But he had managed to get much closer to Dannevirke. He just had to navigate a few more steep sections and then he'd be home free. And so on or around December 30th, Jason began slowly making his way down the mountainside until he reached a decision point. He found himself standing at the top of 2 very steep gullies that both would bring him down to a dry stretch of riverbed, and so either option worked. It just became a matter of which one is safer. And so after making his assessment about which gully he should take, he made his choice and he made his way down and he reached the dry riverbed. And it was at this point that Jason would have begun to feel a pain in his stomach. And that pain would have gotten worse and worse and worse to the point where Jason likely sat down on this dry riverbed, kind of waiting for the pain to subside, but it wouldn't. It would only intensify. And so as he's sitting there kind of wondering what's going on, his vision would begin to blur, and then he would start to struggle breathing. And before he could deal with all of these strange symptoms that were coming on really suddenly, he lost the ability to move his body and he slumped over onto his left side, and there he would lay until he died. It would turn out the gully that Jason had chosen to go down when he was standing at the top and he had those 2 choices, the one he chose, that one contained a plant called Urtica ferox. This plant, which is endemic to New Zealand, grows leaves that are covered in little rigid stinging hairs that contain a toxin called trifidin. And trifidin, in high enough doses, not only causes stomach pain and blurred vision and trouble breathing, but it also causes total body paralysis and even death. Jason, who according to friends would have known about the dangers this plant posed, likely just didn't see the cluster of plants when he was assessing which gully to go down. And so it wasn't until he was partway down the gully and was in these plants that he realized his mistake. But when he turned to go back up, it was just too steep. And so he was forced to trudge through these toxic plants. And because he was wearing shorts, his lower legs were exposed and they were stung repeatedly. And so he was dealt a lethal dose. The reason the pathologist was not able to identify this as Jason's cause of death is because the stingers on those plants, they don't leave any marks on the human body. And its poison, trifidin, is so rare that when they sent out that toxicology report, they didn't include it. They did not test for trifidin. And so it wasn't until 15 years later when the pathologist's colleague heard that Jason had been found in the Ruahine Mountains that the colleague said, wait a minute, have you checked for trifidin? Because he knew the Ruahine Mountains were home to clusters of that toxic plant. And so sure enough, they went back to where Jason's body had been found, and lining the gully that he had come down were dozens and dozens of those plants. Mary Cerruti had a difficult childhood. Growing up in the 1950s and early 1960s in Houston, Texas, Mary's family barely had enough money to get by, and then by the time Mary was 21, both of her parents had passed away, leaving her with nothing. After their deaths, Mary kind of bounced around Houston, going from one low-paying job to the next, and then eventually she met a man that she fell madly in love with and they got married, but unfortunately that marriage would end in divorce. After Mary got over that heartbreak, she would meet another man who she would also fall in love with, and they would get married too, but like her first marriage, this one also ended in divorce. At this point, Mary was so devastated by yet another heartbreak that she just kind of accepted that she was not gonna get married again. She was not gonna have a family of her own. But she didn't let this get her down. Instead, she kind of embraced her life as a loner. Fast forward to 2015, and Mary was 61 years old and she was still living alone. She lived in a small home in a Houston neighborhood. This neighborhood, over the last several decades, had really begun to grow. Lots of new apartment complexes were being built all the time, and in fact, one of the apartment developers had approached Mary and offered to buy her house so they could build over her land, but she had refused because she loved her house. She did not want to sell it. It didn't matter what they offered her. And so she was the only house in this long stretch of apartment buildings that didn't sell. But Mary kind of liked it. She wrote in her diary that her bungalow was like a castle, and all these apartment buildings all around her were her castle walls. Mary didn't really have much contact with other people. She didn't have a consistent job, so she didn't have relationships with coworkers. She didn't have much contact, if any, with her living family, and she really didn't have any friends, with the exception of one woman who was in town who owned an arts and crafts shop, who Mary would periodically go into town and say hello to. But despite all that, Mary was not lonely. She had lots and lots of cats, and she loved cats. Anytime she saw a stray cat out in the neighborhood, Mary would get the cat food and water, and then eventually would try to coax the cat to come into her house, and then when it did, she would win the cat's trust, and then she would give it a place to live, and she would feed it and take care of it. And so before long, she had dozens of cats living in the house with her. And so these cats kind of became Mary's best friends, and so she rarely left the house, if ever. She mostly just stayed in the house with them. In February of that year, one of Mary's neighbors happened to be walking by her property, and they looked over and they saw a stack of mail had grown on her front porch, indicating that Mary had not opened her door to get her mail. And this neighbor also noticed that while Mary's property did tend to get a little bit overgrown with the trees and the grass, it was exceptionally overgrown, like no one was even trying to take care of it. And so this neighbor was concerned that maybe something had happened to Mary, and so they opened up her fence, they walked across the yard, they went up onto the porch, and they knocked on the front door, but it was silent. And so this neighbor kind of leaned over and looked in the window that was just to the left of the door to see if maybe they could look inside, but there was a curtain drawn across that window, so they couldn't see anything. And so the neighbor tried knocking on the door one more time, but again, met with silence. And so after standing there for a minute, the neighbor left the front porch and walked around to the side of the house to see if maybe they could look in one of those windows, but when they went around to the side, those windows were covered with curtains too. So the neighbor walked back to the front of the property and just stood there looking at the house, wondering what they should do. And something told them that something's off, something's wrong, someone needs to make sure Mary really is okay. Someone needs to get inside of this house. And so the neighbor called the Houston police and explained the situation. A few minutes later, the Houston police arrived and they too went right up onto Mary's porch. They knocked on her door. It was met with silence. And so after that, the police talked to one of the other neighbors and got a key that Mary had apparently given them previously. And the police went back to Mary's front door. They used the key. They unlocked the door. They opened it up. And right away, they were hit with this horrible smell coming from inside the house. The police pushed the door the rest of the way open and they stepped inside and they yelled out for Mary, but it was silent. And then before the police even began walking around looking for her, they looked off to their left and the right inside of the house, and they saw there were all these dead cats all over the ground. And so the Houston police didn't know what happened to Mary, but right away they're thinking, okay, we've seen scenarios like this before where someone who lives alone that no one really checks on dies unexpectedly, and then when they pass away, all of their pets are trapped in the house, they're not getting fed, and so they pass away too. And so the police at this point are fully expecting to find Mary's dead body somewhere in the house, and so they begin walking through the house looking for it. But after searching the house top to bottom, they could not find Mary. And so the police leave Mary's house, and at this point there are people outside gathered because they see the police cars. And so the police grabbed a couple of the neighbors and they asked them, do you know anything about this woman? Did she say anything about where she was going? Did you see her leave at any point? And the consensus amongst the neighbors they spoke to was that Mary basically kept to herself. She did not travel. She didn't go anywhere. She mostly just stayed in her house with her cats. And so it was very unlikely that she would have just abandoned the property and abandoned her cats because she loved them so much. And so the police at this point are thinking, okay, she's got to be in this house somewhere. And so the police called a few more officers to the property, and the group went back inside of Mary's house, and they really looked for Mary, thinking that, maybe she slipped into a closet and that's where she passed away, or, maybe she's just hidden somewhere in the house. And so they really kind of ripped the house apart looking for her. But again, there was just nothing. And so after they finally stopped the search without finding Mary, the police contacted Mary's extended family and they asked them the same questions. Did Mary say anything about a trip she was going to take? Is there any reason she would just abandon her property? And they all would say, look, we don't talk to Mary. We don't know where she went. We have no idea. And so for a little while, the Houston police continued to search for Mary in and around Houston, but eventually, after finding nothing, the search kind of stopped and they reached out to Mary's family and said, if you hear anything else about what happened to Mary, please let us know. Several months later, Mary's house went into foreclosure because no one was making the payments anymore, and the bank put her house up for auction. And a real estate entrepreneur in Houston bought the house up quickly, and after cleaning it out, he put it on the market to be rented out. And for the next couple of years, several tenants lived in Mary's old house, none of them staying for very long. Then in March of 2017, when the property was vacant, this young couple reached out to the landlord and said they were looking to rent, and they were hoping to potentially stay in this property for 2 or 3 years. The landlord was thrilled, and he sent over a lease for them to sign. And then once the couple had signed the lease and the property was theirs, the husband decided to just go over on his own and walk around the property and see what they would need to buy in terms of furnishings. And so the husband arrives at the property, he goes in the front door, he walks around the first floor, and then at some point he decides he wants to go up into the attic to see how much storage space they have. And so he gets underneath the trap door in the ceiling, he grabs the string and he pulls it down, revealing this folded up ladder. He flips down the lower ladder piece and puts it on the ground, and then he began climbing up. Once he got up into the attic, he stayed standing on the ladder and just kind of scanned around, and he saw there really wasn't much up there. There was a couple of metal cages that appeared to have been for pets or something, but it was very dirty and dark, and it appeared like no one had really come up here in a long time. And he kind of assumed that, the other tenants weren't using this as a storage space. And so the husband was about to go back down the ladder when he noticed off to the right side of the attic, kind of far away from the ladder, right where the roof begins to pitch down, he saw one of the floorboards was kind of popped up like it shouldn't be. And he stared at it and he's looking around at the rest of the attic and all of the floorboards were perfectly uniform, but that one was really jacked up. And so he was curious, and so he climbed up into the attic and he kind of stooped down and he walked over to this loose floorboard. And when he was standing over it, he could tell that this floorboard had kind of popped off of this hole in the ground, that the floorboard had been covering this hole, but the hole was dark. And so he pulled out his phone and he turned on his flashlight and he looked straight down and he aimed the light into this hole. Now, this hole was basically just a gap between two of the walls on the first floor. And so he's shining his light down into this gap, and he sees at the bottom the remains of the woman the Houston police have been looking for the past 2 years, Mary Cerruti. While no one knows for sure exactly what happened to her, it's believed back in early 2015 when she went missing, she had gone up into the attic where perhaps her cats liked to sunbathe off to the side of the attic because there was a big window that looked into the attic. And so she went up there to maybe feed the cats or check on the cats that were up there. And when she walked over to that side of the attic where the window looked in, she stepped on that loose floorboard and it gave out from her weight and she kind of fell through it like a trap door and fell down into that gap between the walls. It's unlikely she was hurt from this fall, but when she stood back up again in this kind of narrow space, she would have realized very quickly that there was nowhere for her to go. You can't go left, you can't go right, and you can't get back up into the attic. It was too far up for her to reach, and there was no way for her to kind of use the walls to climb back up because the space she was in was so narrow. I mean, she could barely move. She also didn't have a cell phone on her, so she couldn't call anyone. If she screamed out, no one would have heard her because she was behind several walls of insulation. And because no one ever checked on her, there was no one that was just going to find her trapped in the wall. She was totally on her own. And so trapped in this little space, Mary spent probably a couple of days screaming and trying to get her way out, but nothing worked. And then eventually she passed away. And then unfortunately, all of her cats did too. Her death was ruled an accident. One of the most dangerous Olympic sports is called luge. In a nutshell, 1 or 2 people who are called lugers will ride a sled down a hill as fast as they can. But this hill is this narrow, winding, banked ice track, and these lugers will ride a sled that will go as fast as 80 miles per hour or faster. While accidents in luging are actually quite uncommon, when they do occur, they can be catastrophic. In 1986, a luge track was built on a ski hill in Alberta, Canada, for the luge event of the 1988 Winter Olympics. This track and the surrounding ski area was called Canada Olympic Park. After the Olympics were over, this park was open to the public for recreational purposes. Nearly 30 years later, on January 29, 2016, 3 teenage boys snuck into Canada Olympic Park after hours. They made their way up the hill until they reached this blue 6-foot-tall fence that was covered with warnings telling people to stay back and don't go past this fence unless you are authorized personnel, and these 3 teenage boys were not authorized personnel. Inside of this 6-foot-tall blue fence was what looked like this tall flight of stairs that led up to what looked almost like a log cabin. And that cabin was the starting house of the luge track. The track literally came out of the cabin and fed down below. The 3 boys, one of which had actually worked at this park the winter before selling tickets, they looked at each other and grinned and then chucked their plastic sleds over this blue fence, and then they climbed up and over themselves. Once on the other side, they each picked up their sled and then made their way up the stairs into the starting house. Once they were inside, they kind of arranged themselves to see who would go first, second, and third. They put their helmets on because they all brought helmets. They strapped on headlamps so they could see the course because there were no lights on the course. And then one by one, they began going down this luge track. But surprisingly, it wasn't that fast. As they went down, they would actually stop and have to use their feet to get going again. But that was because they had these cheap plastic sleds that were not designed for this luge course. What you needed were these specialty sleds with blades on the sides that got you up to full speed. And so after the 3 boys eventually, slowly, painfully made their way all the way down to the bottom of this luge track, they were pretty disappointed, but they thought, okay, well, let's just all get in one sled and we'll go down again, and with the added weight, we should go faster. And so they marched their way back up, all the way up to the top of the starting house, and all 3 of them sat in one sled and they pushed off, and sure enough, they went way faster. They bombed all the way down this track. It was so much fun. They were totally exhilarated. And after doing it a couple more times, they decided, okay, our luck's gonna run out. We're gonna get caught. And so they climbed back over that blue fence and snuck out of the park without getting caught. The following weekend, those 3 same boys, along with 5 of their friends they had recruited, returned to Canada Olympic Park after hours. And so the 3 boys that had been there the weekend before, they led the group up the hill. They got to that blue fence that surrounded the luge starting house. And one by one, each of these teenage boys climbed up and over this fence, and they made their way up the stairs into the starting house. Once they were inside, they began figuring out who was going to go in each of the 3 sleds they had brought along. And they determined they would put 3 boys in the first sled, 3 boys in the second sled, and 2 boys in the final sled. Because of how successful the previous weekend's trip down the luge track had been, according to the 3 boys that had gone, this time the group decided they did not need helmets because this was relatively safe. They also decided not to bring headlamps because they figured it would be more exhilarating to go flying down this track in the darkness. And so a little after midnight on February 6th, the first 3 boys climbed into the first sled and pushed off. At first, it was going exactly to plan. It was fun, they were going fast, it was exhilarating, but then disaster struck. Unlike the previous weekend, this weekend, there was a metal chain that had been strung across one of the sections towards the bottom of the luge track. It was there to keep a particular section of the track in place. And so these boys, as they come flying around the corner, they don't see it, and they strike this chain at full speed. Now, this chain was at neck height, and so when it hit them, it instantly decapitated and killed one of the boys. It was a 17-year-old named Evan Caldwell. And so he dies immediately, and the other 2 are thrown from the sled and landed unconscious. Now, back up at the starting house, they have no way of knowing this has happened to the first sled. Not only because they can't see anything, but also because the boys in the first sled are not making any sound. They're either unconscious or deceased. And so at some point, this second group of boys thinks they've waited long enough to account for the first sled to get down and out of the way. And so they load up their sled and they push off. And so they go flying down, it's going great, but just like the first sled, at some point they turn that corner and they hit that chain. But miraculously, the second group of 3 boys, they hit the chain in such a way that they kind of slipped under it. And so they were all thrown from their sled and kind of smashed into the track. But the worst injury of the second sled was just a broken ankle. And so this group, they stand up and they're totally disoriented. It's dark. They don't know what they just ran into. And before they had a chance to kind of collect their thoughts and yell up to the starting house to try to warn the third and final group not to go, it was already too late. All the boys could do in the second sled group was to just get out of the way as the third and final sled carrying the final two boys came bombing down, and they too struck that chain at full speed. One of the two boys on board this third and final sled was a 17-year-old named Jordan Caldwell, and he too, unfortunately, would be decapitated by the chain and would die instantly. And he was actually the twin brother of Evan Caldwell, the boy on the first sled who had also died. The other boy on the third sled would be thrown from the sled and would suffer grievous injuries as well. One of the survivors of the crash, who was actually on the first sled, his name was Caleb, and he was knocked unconscious from being thrown. When he came to, he was laying in a section of the track that was covered by a tarp, and at first he couldn't see anything, he couldn't hear anything, but he just felt like there was something lodged in his throat, and it was making it very hard to breathe. Most likely that was just from his throat being crushed in from hitting that chain. And so as he's struggling to breathe, his senses began to come back to him, and his sight came back, and he noticed he was laying down, and one of the boys who had been on the second sled was kneeling next to him. This was one of the boys that had not been badly hurt, and he had his hand on Caleb's shoulder, and he was praying for Caleb to survive. And so as Caleb is taking in that someone is praying over him, he notices somewhere else, his hearing is starting to pick up. He can hear someone else, and it would turn out to be a boy named Mark, who was on the first sled, who had been very badly injured. His face was very badly beaten up. He was laying somewhere nearby, and he was just singing this religious song. He was trying to keep spirits high, and he was trying to will people to hold on and to survive as long as they possibly could. And then Caleb remembered hearing someone calling 911, and then he doesn't remember what happened next. When the paramedics ultimately arrived within the hour, they got to the track and they found all of these boys spread out all over the track because when they hit this chain, they got sent flying. But they discovered the twins were actually laying right next to each other, and none of these surviving boys had moved their bodies. And so even though the grief was just unfathomable amongst this family that had lost their two sons, there was some solace in the fact that despite having come down in different sleds, that the twins, Evan and Jordan, were together in their final moments. The 6 survivors of this accident would walk away from it with life-changing head injuries and other medical issues, and they would walk away with an indescribable sense of guilt and regret. But they consider themselves lucky because at least they survived. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are only available on YouTube. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see you.
Many questions that I have for you. There's more than 21, but less than 22. I wanna make some sense out of what's in your head. I wanna make some sense, no baloney but bread. Quid pro quo is all I know. A friend in need is a friend indeed. That's what I say to get my way. Quid pro quo is all I know. A friend in need is a friend indeed. That's what I say to get my way. Quid pro quo is all I know. A friend in need is a friend indeed. That's what I say to get my way. And now I'm all alone at the end of it all. I used to be a big deal, but now I feel so small. I traded true connection to stare at my reflection. I wanna make some sense out of what's in your head. I wanna make some sense, no baloney but bread. Quid pro quo is all I know. A friend in need.
As many of you may know, the biggest event ever to come out of Ballen Studios is fast approaching. From September 26th to October 20th, I will be on tour. I'll be visiting 15 cities across the United States, telling strange, dark, and mysterious stories live and in person. Last year we did one show. It was a sold-out show in Austin, Texas, to kind of trial run this concept, and it's basically just me on stage telling stories, and people loved it, and there was huge demand for more, and so here we are, doing 15 more shows. Tickets for these 15 shows have been selling very quickly, but there are still tickets available if you act basically right now. All you have to do is go to tour.ballenstudios.com, find the show that is, nearest you or whichever one you're interested in, click on the link, and if there are tickets still available, you can buy them through that link. And if you're lucky, there might even be some VIP tickets left, which will give you access to meet this guy, if that's of interest to you. Also, just for our VIP ticket holders, bring your copy of our graphic novel and I'll sign it for you when we meet. And so the way you get the book is either you have already pre-ordered it or you can buy a copy at the theater. We'll be selling them on site. Again, I'm going to be on tour from September 26th to October 20th, telling stories in person. It's going to be great. If you want to go, there are still tickets, but they're going quick. Just go to tour.ballenstudios.com and get your tickets today. Okay, back to the stories. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the 5-star review button needs a pair of socks, offer to loan them a pair of yours. But make sure they're the kind of socks that immediately slip down under your heel into the shoe as soon as you start walking. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Amazon Music, because starting November 1st of this year, 2022, our podcast is only going to be available on Amazon Music. However, from now until November 1st, you can still get the podcast on all platforms: YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, everywhere. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Last weekend, I looked over and I saw old Seagull Lung sitting at his miniature 1999 era G3 iMac, and I couldn't help but notice he was looking a little downtrodden. And when I saw what he was doing on his iMac, I knew why. He was hitting refresh over and over and over again on his MySpace page, and it wasn't changing the numbers. Old Lung hasn't had a view on his MySpace page since 2010. To cheer him up, I decided I would purchase a MySpace view bot and flood his page with tens of views. So I ran over to my windmill-powered laptop and began slapping away at the keys to navigate to an online vendor that sold MySpace view bots. However, as soon as I clicked on the link, this website is a virus, not an online vendor for MySpaceViewbots.com, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. Unbelievably, that website was riddled with malware, and so immediately my windmill-powered laptop caught on fire and then exploded, sending shrapnel raining down on me. Luckily, old Lung was in the other room and he heard the commotion, and he leapt into the room and he pushed me out of the way just in time. And then after the dust had settled, old Lung gave me a big hug and then slapped me right in the anti-tragus and said, "Papa, wenn du ständig auf gefährliche Webseiten klickst, dann brauchst du NordVPN." Which of course in German means, "Papa, if you're going to keep clicking on dangerous websites, then use NordVPN." And boy was old Lungy right. A VPN, or virtual private network, is a service that keeps you safe when you browse the internet, and NordVPN is the brand name in the VPN space. Not only will NordVPN keep your data safely behind their wall of next-generation encryption, but also, most importantly, they will block malware hosting websites and annoying pop-up ads and botnet control. So, if your online shopping seems to always turn into explosions and other various catastrophes caused by malware-hosted websites, then you need to take old Lungy's advice too and sign up for NordVPN today. Right now, you can sign up for a 2-year plan at a huge discount, plus get 4 additional months for free when you go to nordvpn.com/MrBallen. And it's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/MrBallen, or click the link in the description below. Okay, back to the story.